Today, we are talking about the Department of Government Efficiency. We've seen a lot of support for this new department, and we've also seen a lot of pushback. But in this video, we are going to be focusing on the economic impact and some things we can expect to see in the economy with this new department looking to cut federal spending. Before I do get into the video, please make sure to like the video and also subscribe to the YouTube. Really appreciate your support. I'm also going to put a QR code down below for a Bitcoin tip. If you want to support the channel, feel free to leave me a little Bitcoin tip. Now let's get into it. The Department of Government Efficiency, also known as DOGE, was established on January 20th of this year and is scheduled to conclude on July 4th of next year. The idea behind this department is President Donald Trump wants Elon and his DOGE team to look into government spending and find ways where we can become more efficient, find areas where we can cut spending. And I kind of like this idea because it's no secret that the United States has a big spending problem. That's why we're $36 trillion in debt. And that's why we have trillion-dollar deficits. So I think that this is a good idea. I know that a lot of people are upset. A lot of people are losing their jobs. And it's definitely a shift to see the United States actually cutting spending. But overall, I think it's a good thing when you look at the U.S. fiscal situation. Let's look at some of the actions that the DOGE team has taken so far. They started out by offering a deferred resignation package to 2 million federal workers. So basically offering them payment to quit their jobs. And I think that a small percentage of these federal workers took that package. They have dismantled the U.S. Agency for International Development, and they've worked with departments like the Department of Agriculture and the Department of Education to trim some expenses there. We saw the Department of Agriculture terminated 18 contracts totaling $9 million, and the Department of Education terminated 70 grants totaling $373 million. And these are just a couple of examples of actions that this DOGE department has taken over their first month or so of operating. But what's really cool about DOGE is they have this website. It's called doge.gov, where they show all the expenses that they're cutting. They're pretty transparent about it. And what it looks like so far is that this department is cutting a lot of these smaller, unnecessary expenses. And for you and I, the taxpayer, we should be asking ourselves if these are expenses that we really want to pay for. We've seen some pretty ridiculous expenses that Elon has pointed out in his investigation of the federal government. The U.S. is spending money on biodiversity conservation in Nepal, Central American gender assessment consulting services, and many other things that, you know, if given the choice, I'm sure a lot of U.S. taxpayers wouldn't want to be paying for. So I think it's a good thing that they're going into the U.S. expenses and cutting a lot of these smaller things that we probably shouldn't be spending money on. I'm sure that a lot of taxpayers are not happy seeing a lot of these expenses, even though they are small. Now, the question is, can DOGE actually make a difference? Because what they're doing right now is they're cutting a lot of these smaller expenses. We heard Elon come out and say that their goal is to cut $2 trillion worth of expenses, but I think that's a little bit unrealistic. And the only way that you could actually do that is if you cut some of these larger budget items. And when we look at the US spending, there are really two big problems and two areas where the US really needs to cut if they want to curb their spending, and that's Social Security and Medicare. There's obviously the interest on debt expense, which is huge and continuing to grow, and the only way to trim down that expense is to get out of deficits. There's defense spending, which is something the U.S. spends a lot on, but with a tense world, with conflicts going on, I think it's going to be difficult to cut too much of that defense spending. So the two budget items that I look at where the U.S. can really do some big cutting are Social Security and Medicare. And I actually just did a video about this pretty recently. the US is spending over $1 trillion more on these programs combined that they take in through tax receipts for those programs. And that's a huge problem. You can't be spending over $1 trillion more for something than you collect for it. I know that a lot of people rely on these programs. I know that it's very unpopular for politicians and administrations to make changes to these programs. But the reality of the situation is, until you make some big cuts to Social Security and Medicare, you're not going to fix the US spending problem. Looking at the economic impact from what DOGE is doing, one positive is that we're cutting federal spending. We may not be cutting that much. I doubt that this DOGE team is going to be able to cut $2 trillion worth of spending. But if we are cutting spending, then we are moving in the right direction. Now, I personally believe it's too late for the US and their fiscal situation. This interest on debt monster has grown too strong, too powerful, and I don't believe that the US is going to be able to get out of deficits. For the US to do that, they're going to have to produce a lot more, and they're going to have to spend a lot less, and I think it's just going to be too difficult to do. But this is a start, right? Looking at the government and saying, hey, what can we cut out from these expenses? And something that we should be thinking about as a society is, what do we want the government to spend money on, and what do we need the government to spend money on, and what are we willing to all pitch in for to help make society better, whether that's defense, education, or whatever. But when we look at government, I really think it operates a lot better when it's a bit smaller. When government gets too big, we just see money misallocated, and I really think that the free market is better at allocating that money. And when we see a lot of these services more private than public, I think that society works a little bit better. A negative with DOGE cutting spending is we are seeing budget cuts and layoffs. I hate to see anyone lose their job, and I know that a lot of people have worked very hard to get to the position that they're at, and now they're seeing their department getting terminated, which sucks. And it looks like we are probably going to see more layoffs on the horizon here, and this is going to have a negative impact on the economy in the short term. If people are getting laid off, that means that they're spending less money, and that means that businesses are probably making less money. So this could be a recessionary catalyst. You pair that with something like these tariffs that have been floating around, and we could see the economy not be so great over the next year. But again, this plan to cut government spending it's a long-term plan, right? It's a plan to set up the US long-term and to shift away from government reliance and really make the government smaller. And I know that for a lot of people that sucks in the short term, but I think in the long term, having smaller government that just focuses on those core expenses is better. And we're already seeing some of the economic impacts of these layoffs. In Washington, D.C., we have seen home prices falling ever since the DOGE committee came into being, because there's so many government workers there who are probably going to get laid off. And people are anticipating that this will negatively impact the housing market in DC, which it probably will. And just overall, I feel like if we see hundreds of thousands of these government workers getting laid off, this is going to lead to less demand in the economy. It could have implications for the stock market, and it could have implications for small businesses. And when we look at some of the actions that this new administration has taken within the first couple of months, it looks like they're setting up a long-term plan, but we could see the economy suffer over the next year. And one thing I was thinking about with the stock market is we know that the stock market, as well as other markets, react strongly to this government data that we get, like the CPI and the employment data. And with government jobs being cut, I think that we could see some pretty bad jobs numbers over the next couple of months. For a long time, the jobs numbers have been propped up by these government jobs that have been added. And a lot of these government jobs really aren't helping the economy grow. For example, when the US hires a bunch of IRS agents to crack down on people for their taxes, those jobs aren't helping the economy grow. They're not producing anything. If anything, they're weakening the economy, and there's a lot of jobs in the government. I'm not saying all of the jobs are not helping the economy grow, but there are many jobs that are really actually restricting the economy. And we've seen government jobs continue to grow. If we look at this chart here, this shows the jobs that have been added over the past 12 months from different sectors, different industries. And as you can see, for government jobs, they've added more jobs than any other industry or any other sector except for private education and health services. So that just tells you that the jobs numbers are propped up by government jobs. And now if we see a bunch of these government jobs being cut, these jobs numbers are not going to look as great. When the job numbers come out over the next couple of months and they don't look as great, I suspect that we could see the stock market react negatively. So some dates that I'm keeping my eye on are March 7th for the February jobs number, April 4th for the March jobs number, and May 2nd for the April jobs number. We know that historically the stock market likes to react to this government data. So we'll see what happens on those dates. Although we're seeing layoffs in the short term and we're seeing these public services being cut, I think the hope here is that if a lot of these services are benefiting the public, if they are benefiting society, that we'll see them pop up in the private sector in the long term. I think one of the problems with government getting too big is that we don't know if a lot of these services are really benefiting society as a whole. The free market is better at determining if a service is worth the expense. And when we look at the government, there are a lot of services that the government does that probably aren't worth the expense. Now, there are also a lot of beneficial services that people really rely upon, and I'm sure services that people are willing to chip in for to help the whole, to help society. And I hope that this Department of Government Efficiency doesn't cut those services. But if they do cut a lot of services and those services are benefiting the society as a whole, then I think there is a place for them in the private sector. And it's just going to take time for those services to emerge. So it could be detrimental in the short term, but I think in the long term, if we can shrink government and we can have a lot of these services done more privately or more in local governments rather than at the federal government level, then that would be good. While I do think it's good that the government is looking to cut expenses and operate more efficiently, I do feel for all those who are losing their jobs. I think that it's tough going through a transition period. And I also think that we could see this hurt the economy in the short term. As I mentioned before, we could see it be a catalyst for weaker consumer demand. So just something to keep our eyes on over the next 6 months, next year. We'll have to see how aggressive these layoffs are and these cuts are. But if they are aggressive, and it seems like they're going to be, that could mean a lot of people getting laid off, and it could hurt the economy in the short term. So just something to keep our eyes on. That's going to wrap it up for this video. If you didn't like and subscribe, please make sure to do that now. Thanks for watching. I'll be back soon.